with something, to put on needle length this large and also to have this many buds across the tree. This actually has a lot of back buds on it, which is relatively rare for ponderosas, unless they're very healthy and unless they've been fertilized relatively heavily. So anytime you're going to be working on a tree, whether it's a pine, juniper, hornbeam, doesn't matter the species, we want the trees to be as healthy as possible to begin with, because typically when we work on them, particularly if we're going to be wiring the trees and bending the branches, that's inevitably going to weaken the trees just a little bit. So we want to make sure that they're healthy going into this type of style.
What is the percentage of green that you're going to put on the tree?
What's the question?
Sorry, yes. What is the percentage of growth that I can take off the tree, the needles that I can take off the tree all at once? It depends on a few different factors. It can depend on the species that you're working with. Some trees respond more negatively to the more growth that you take off of them. Some trees respond more positively. So, for example, with pines, if we take off a lot of growth at this time of year on the pine, what are we, kind of mid-August right now, there's not enough growing season left for the tree to produce another set of adventitious buds, which is kind of back budding on the tree this year. It's a little bit late for that. So there's the potential if I take off too much growth now, it's not going to back bud again, and we're not going to end up, we're going to take off too much growth leading into fall, which means there's not enough green there for the tree to reabsorb the chlorophyll and set itself up for winter dormancy. So if we overdo it at this time of year, you can actually weaken the tree going into winter, particularly if you have a very, very harsh winter coming up. If we're dealing with a ponderosa, let's say in early June, for example, so a couple months prior, if we take off a lot of foliage at that point, there's plenty of time for the tree to actually set up and produce new adventitious buds between June and, let's say, September or October, when the trees start going dormant. So I'm more comfortable actually taking off more growth at that time of year than I would be at this time of year. All that's to say, what I'm going to do on this tree today is probably take off close to about 50%. That's pushing the limit. I wouldn't really want to go beyond that for the most part. It is dependent on the species, though. So just to give you an example here, if we're working with something like a juniper, there's all sorts of different species and cultivars of junipers that we work with. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. All sorts of different cultivars and species. So let's say you're working with the most common juniper that we use in bonsai would be Juniperus chinensis. So these would be what we call a shinpaku. You guys heard that word before? Pretty common word in the bonsai world. These are Juniperus chinensis that have kind of a scale-like foliage to them. So it could be Itoigawa, it could be Kishu. These are different varieties of cultivars that you'll run into. Each of those different varieties and cultivars are going to have limits for how much foliage you can take off. So, for example, if we're talking about Itoigawa, which is a very famous variety and or cultivar of Juniperus chinensis or shinpaku, if you take off more than about 30–40% of the growth in any one session, it's going to revert to juvenile foliage in the upcoming growing season, which means basically that scale foliage is going to turn to very spiky, elongated foliage. And it's going to take a long time to get it back to the more desirable scale foliage. If we're talking about Kishu, even though it's the same species, Juniperus chinensis, it's a different variety or a different cultivar, depending on the source, you can take off significantly more growth on a Kishu before it will revert to juvenile, or before it will weaken. So we can take off 70–80% of the growth on a Kishu and it will respond just fine. If we look at other species like, let's say, Juniperus sabina, so Sabina juniper from Spain, if you were to cut off 30–40% of the growth and prune back all of the shoot tips across the tree, you're going to severely weaken the tree. Whereas, let's say, a Rocky Mountain juniper, we can cut off a crap load of growth on those trees. They'll revert to juvenile, but they'll still be healthy afterwards. So it all depends on the plants and the cultivar, the species, all of that. So it can get very confusing very quickly. So what I try to do is break things down into big, broad categories for the most part. So this is why we've got double flush, single flush pines. All of the double flush pines, for the most part, are treated the same way. Pretty much all of the single flush pines are treated the same way. There are a few variations here and there, but for the most part, we can put them into big, broad categories. So, yeah, if you just sort of keep it straight, with this being a single flush pine, the things we're going to be talking about today are not only applicable to ponderosas, they're going to be applicable to Japanese white pine, a lodgepole pine, limber pine here in the United States. Virginia pine, I would consider to be mostly a single flush pine as well, although some people would argue with me on that. So once you start breaking things down into these big, broad categories, it makes it a little bit easier.
I've got a question.
Sure.
On a single flush
reducing the length of the needles, or you like it to have the showing that it seems to have natural?
So, yeah, my goal really with any tree is to reduce the foliage size as much as possible. So ideally you should be selecting for plants either species, cultivars, or genetic anomalies that have naturally small foliage to begin with. Obviously when we're dealing with ponderosa pines, it's not something you can really...
How would you do that on that number?
Right, so the way we would reduce the needle length on a tree like this is through a couple of ways. So one is withholding water a little bit during the first part of the growing season when the first flush of growth is coming out. There's a limit to that though. If you overdo it, you can kill branches on the tree. You can also put these trees in very fast draining soil mix. So for a tree like this, you could do 1 part akadama, which is translates to kind of red clay balls, but it's high fired clay essentially from Japan. 1 part pumice, 1 part what's called kiryu, which is a river sand, and then potentially 2 parts lava rock on a plant like this. It's going to help it drain very fast. So that will help make it easier to maintain the proper water levels for the tree, not overwatering it. The second thing is going to be to withhold fertilizer in the first part of the growing season, especially fertilizer that has a high nitrogen value. So typically with single flush pines like this, if my goal is to try to reduce the needle size, I will withhold fertilizer from the spring up until the first flush of growth hardens off, which the earliest would be mid-July, maybe late July, before I put fertilizer on the plants. Now you could fertilize with zero nitrogen fertilizer during the first part of the growing season, which might not be a bad option. It's really the nitrogen that's going to extend the needle length on these trees, but those would be the ways to reduce needle length. Now that being said, it depends on the stage of development of a tree as to whether or not I want to reduce the needle size at all. So a tree like this, it's a newly collected tree, but it's got a ton of budding on it already. It's got a ton of branching on it already. After I style the tree today, my goal next year would probably be to go ahead and start reducing the needle size on the plant. However, if you're dealing with a ponderosa that's much more sparse than this, after you style the plant, for example, you may not really, you may want to produce a lot of back budding on the tree. And the only way you're going to do that is through heavy fertilization. So you may not need to care about needle size for 2, 3, 4 years while you're developing back buds on the plant. So you may want to fertilize very heavily in the first part of the growing season for 2, 3, 4 years until you get the proper back budding on the plant. So it's really important to identify the stage of development of your tree, and that will dictate a lot of the horticultural maintenance. So the way I break it down is you've got trees in early development, which are plants where you're trying to put on size on the trees. So you're trying to develop the primary structure of the plant. It could be thickening of the trunk, it could be thickening of the branching on the trees, it could be putting on a density to the foliage. Then as you develop that, as you move into the second category, this is going to be kind of mid stages of development. This is where we're moving more towards developing secondary branch structure on the trees. So we're trying to slow the growth down just a little bit. Once we build that secondary structure, then we're moving into refinement. We're building the tertiary structure. So this is a really fine branching on the trees. It's at that point where we're starting to try to really reduce the needle size or the leaf size on a plant. So fertilization will shift from category to category. What other questions do you guys got?
If this season grow, when we're talking needles are formed in June, let's say, when the needles done forming, and a long shoot, can you cut that new grow in
Like the new candle?
new candle in half or a little bit to 1 inch after needles formed? What will
Okay.
happen?
Right. So, very good question. This is dependent. This type of technique is dependent on the pine species that you're working with. What he's asking is, in the spring when you've got the new candles that are elongating, which is just the new growth that's emerging on the tree, some species, the candles will become very, very long in that first 2 or 3 months of the growing season, whether you fertilize or not. They just naturally produce elongating candles. Some species produce almost no length to the candles. Ponderosa pine is one of those species that very rarely will produce an extended candle length. So really with ponderosas, from my experience, for the most part, I do no breaking or cutting of those candles during the growing season at all. They're just not long enough to cut back. It's not necessary. If you're dealing with something like, we'll say like a Japanese white pine, for example, depends on the cultivar, but standard Japanese white pine, quite often they'll put slightly extended candles out, or Scots pine is another great example, they'll put extended candles out. Those trees, you can break back or cut back the candles to an average length across the whole tree to balance energy. I typically recommend doing that sometime in the first part of June before the growth fully hardens off. If you do it too late in the growing season, there's typically not enough time for a new terminal bud to set up at the end of that candle. I wish I had a whiteboard up here so I could draw this for you. This is probably a little confusing, but if you want more visuals on this, I have an online learning platform on my website. It's multi-u.com. If you sign up for that, we do demos every week, live Q&As every week, but there's a library of probably 250 videos at this point in there, and you can actually see up close filming and explanation of all of it.
That branch extension's dead?
No, it's not dead. So there's a difference between decandling, which means completely removing 100% of the candle, which is what we do only on double flush pines, and what we do on single flush pines, which is cutting the candle to an average length across the tree. When we do that on a single flush pine, we're still leaving some of the new needles from this year on that candle that we're cutting back. If you cut below those needles, it may or may not form a new terminal bud. If you leave some of those needles at the base of probably the last pair of needles closest to the cut site, a new terminal bud will form. Let's say you cut it in early June. Usually by mid-July, late July, you'll see a new terminal bud forming at the end there. And that will be a viable bud that will hold on until the next spring when it flushes out again with a new set of growth.
And will cutting that back encourage back budding, or sort of you're in trouble?
It can potentially induce back budding. What I find induces back budding more though is a combination of a few things. So fertilization, heavy fertilization will help with this. Removing needles during the sort of month of June, kind of the first part of summer each year, will also help induce back budding, and that is because the trees are using the needles, this photosynthetic surface, to feed themselves via photosynthesis. So if you remove that photosynthetic surface from the tree freaks out and thinks, I need to produce more needles to photosynthesize to feed myself. So what does it do? It produces back buds at that point. So you're better off, let's say with the ponderosa in the month of June, removing a whole bunch of old needles, potentially 100% of last year's needles proactively from the tree, only leaving this year's growth, and fertilizing heavily at the same time through the rest of the growing season, you're likely to see adventitious buds form. Now they're not going to form on crazy old wood like on the trunk here. That's not going to happen. It's going to form typically further out towards the end where the branches haven't started really barking up. It's really difficult to get them to back bud further than that, but at least you get some back budding on the plant. The needles will not form from those buds in the same year. So if you say you do it in June, you pluck the needles, the adventitious buds will form. They're these little bitty nubs that'll form typically by September, October, somewhere in that range, they're done forming. The next year, some of those will turn into full candles. Some of those will produce just a sprig of needles, maybe 2 or 3 needles here and there, and the following year they'll become candles. But that's the only way you can really induce back budding on these trees, right? So, and that technique, the proactive removal of last year's needles in the early part of summer, you can do with any single flush pine and help induce back budding on those trees.
If you decandle or cut those candles back too late in the season and it doesn't form a bud, is it possible a bud will form next season? Or?
Potentially. It's less likely though. Yeah, it's less likely. There are some people who swear by a technique that scares the crap out of me that I would never do, but a lot of people swear by in the fall going through the entire tree and breaking off the terminal bud that is formed, breaking it off, and the next year people swear that you get back budding all over the branches. I've never done it, but a lot of professionals who've been doing this for years, like out in Denver. I think Larry Jackal is actually maybe the guy who came up with this. Yeah, in his book. Yeah, I don't know if he came up with the technique, but he was the one who sort of popularized the technique. Swears by it, but he lives in Denver, which is where these are native to. I would not really want to do that in the Southeast. They just aren't vigorous enough down there, so it scares me a little bit to do it in that environment.
What if you miss the window? Like if you're too late
To
a white pine to decandle a white pine or
to cut the candles back. So usually the visual cue that I'm looking for as kind of the end of the time frame when it's okay to do that technique would be when the new terminal bud is forming on that first candle. So basically the new candles start moving and emerging in, for us, like mid-March. Up here is probably early April, things start moving a little bit. Typically by about the end of June in Tennessee, on the ends of those new candles, if nothing has been done to them, the new terminal bud is starting to form at the end. Right? You can actually see this little bitty nub that's forming there. If you prune back the candle beyond that point, there's less and less opportunity or less growing season available for that candle to produce a new terminal bud in place of the one that you just cut off. So I usually use that as kind of my visual cue. What that typically means time frame wise, and what I've found to be safe in Tennessee anyway, is sometime from like the last week of May to, let's say, the end of the second week of June is optimal timing. I can do it anytime during that period, and that's still plenty of time afterwards for a new terminal bud to form. Here, it's probably not going to be too much different because your growing season is not only shorter on the front end, but shorter on the back end from us too. So I would think optimally it'd be about the same time here too. As plants aren't only responding to changes in temperature, they're responding to changes in daylight hour length as well. There's photoreceptors in the trees. So, you know, once you get past the summer solstice, the days get shorter and shorter and shorter. And even though we may not be perceiving that, the trees are perceiving that. So even if the temperatures aren't changing, because the daylight hours are getting shorter, the trees are starting to go ahead and set up for winter dormancy that early on. Right? So, you know, the mechanics within the tree are changing a little bit. The hormones within the tree are changing at that point. So you got to be careful, you know, how late in the season you do that type of work. Okay, so I've got some of the needles off the tree. We're going to be removing some branches on here too, so I don't want to spend too much time just needle plucking up here. What I want to do now is figure out design-wise what we're going to do with the plant, and we're going to cut some of the branching off of the tree. So typically what I do design-wise with plants, whether it's a conifer or deciduous or a broadleaf evergreen tree, is I start with the base of the tree and kind of work my way up towards the top. The goal is to show off certain features, eliminate or hide flaws within the tree. And the best starting point from my perspective is always at the base of the plant. We're always looking for, ideally, the widest base and the best sort of taper up through the trunk. We also want to see, if possible, a flared base with what's called a radial nabari, so a radial surface root structure. When you're dealing with conifers, especially collected conifers, it's very rare to have a radial nabari or a radial surface root spread on these trees. It's almost impossible to find. These guys are typically wedged between rocks, or they've fallen over and some of the roots have ripped out, so you're never really going to have you know, a nice radial nabari. That being said, we do want to show off the widest flare possible. So this tree, from multiple different angles, it actually has about the same flare. To be honest, it's not radial, but you know, it's nice flare from different angles. This angle in particular here, though, the way, it's probably hard to tell from where you guys are sitting, the way that the roots sort of interact with the soil surface here, it looks pretty powerful to me. I think it's kind of interesting. So this is probably going to be a good potential front through here. But the next thing we need to do is look at the trunk line of the tree. What we want to try to do is show off the most movement within the plant and potentially, ideally, the most taper within the trunk. So what that often means is that even though this might be the best base of the tree, maybe it doesn't have the best movement, maybe we have to shift it 5 degrees this way, you know, 20 degrees that way, and find a compromise. Maybe we lose a little bit of the visual of the nabari, but we gain some visual in the trunk. So if you look at the trunk line here, it's actually relatively straight through the center of the trunk. There's a little bit of taper through here, a little bit of subtle movement, but you do lose, you have a little bit of straightness there. It's just not that interesting. That being said, what we could do is eliminate something major on the tree to then bring out some new movement in the plant. So one option is, if we keep this as the front, we have the trunk moving through here, and when we get to this section here where we've got the primary trunk line in the middle, and then a branch on the left side, the upper side here, and a branch on the bottom side. So basically we have a trifurcation here, so 3 branches emerging from the same spot. If we were to eliminate this big one in the middle, which is all of this foliage up here, that would then give you a new primary line to the tree with a lot more taper and a lot more potential movement in the plant. All right, so that's one potential option here. The question is, can I still build a cool tree if I cut that off? Because that's probably 30% of the growth right there. It just comes right off the tree. So this is always the dilemma when doing a demo. The tree has to look really cool after we get done. I have to wow you guys a little bit, and it has to survive. So all 3 things have to happen. If we do that, that leaves us this growth down here. That leaves us this down here, which I'm still not fully convinced about either. That leaves us this branch under here. and all of this growth right here. So I think that might actually be kind of cool. Actually, I said it's really straight through here, which it is, but there's a little bit of subtle movement up through here. If the base of this tree were a little bit softer, a little bit more dainty, it's pretty powerful down here, there's a lot of movement here, but if it were a little bit softer down through here, I might actually try to turn this into a Bunjin style tree or a literati tree, which is a very tall, elegant plant, in which case I would keep the height on this tree here, and actually probably eliminate at least this branch, if not that one as well. And we'd be dealing with a lot less foliage on the tree in the long run, but a much more sort of feminine, soft-looking tree. But it's going to be a mismatch, I think, between the character of doing that, which is soft and elegant, with this big, powerful base here. So from that perspective, I think I want to try to mimic the movement down here in the upper part of the tree. So I actually do think it makes sense to get rid of that there.
Well, that, a lot of the branch on the right,
This one here.
marked up as it is, you're not gonna get any back budding for the first 16 inches.
Yeah, you won't get any back budding. And we're talking about this branch right here. Yeah, you're not going to get any back budding in here. That's impossible. So there's only really two options with this branch here. If we're using this as the front, for example, one would be to put some raffia on here, which is kind of like a reed or a grass that we wrap around branches when we want to severely bend them. I could actually bend this down as kind of a cascading style branch. The other option would be to just eliminate this entirely and turn it into a gin feature. I'm leaning more towards that because taking a branch like this isn't that thick, but there's not really any taper to it. And even if I put the movement into it, it's gonna look a little contrived, I think, and it's gonna take years for this to hold. Ponderosas are notorious for springing back after you wire them. They don't thicken very quickly either, so it takes a very long time for a wire to bite into the branch and create scar tissue, which then holds the branch in place. So I would be more inclined to remove this branch. I think we'll probably end up doing that.
So what about grafting into that lower right branch?
So you could graft into the branch here. But the thing is, if you're going to spend the time to graft, you might as well graft entirely new foliage on the tree, right? So rather than taking, say, a scion from the end out here of ponderosa foliage and sticking it back here to get it to take, or even doing an approach graft, which is possible to do, I would probably switch all of the foliage out across the tree to, say, Japanese black pine, for example, or Scots pine. Looks really cool on ponderosa sometimes. It's a long process changing the foliage out on a tree like this. It would take years and years to get it to fill back in. But in the long run, it'd be easier to maintain, I think, because like I said, you could turn this that is a single flush pine into a double flush pine by grafting black pine to it. So once you graft that black pine to this tree, you can then decandle the tree every summer and expedite the ramification process on the tree and reduce the needle size down to whatever size you want. Right? The later you decandle a tree in the summer, the smaller the secondary growth. So if you wanted to have needles on this tree that are like a ½ inch long, you could do that. I wouldn't recommend it because it's a pretty big tree, relatively big tree. Tree this size, I'd probably want about 1.5 inch long needles would be ideal across the plant, but we could time decandling at just the right time in the summer to get that effect on the tree. But just to give you an idea, doing what's called scion grafting or side veneer grafting on a tree like this, where we take basically what amounts to a cutting off of a black pine and insert that into the bark on this tree, we could probably put, I would say, maybe 12, 15, 18 grafts at one time on this plant. Let's assume that on a good tree, let's say 70% take. Pines are a little difficult to get to take, so you're usually looking at maybe closer to 50% of them failing. So 8 grafts maybe take on a tree like this. You're looking at probably easily 5 to 8 years before you even have something that even starts to look good, and then it's going to be another 5 to 8 years beyond that before you can really start to ramify the tree. So minimum of like a 10, 12-year investment to make it work. So
Whack it on.
yeah, I think cutting it off is the best option. Okay, so I'm going to cut off the top here. We're going to cut off the bottom here. Anytime you're cutting off big branches on a conifer, we want to turn those into what's called a gin feature, which is basically a deadwood branch on a tree. You go out in nature, you look at these guys up in the high elevation mountains. Dead branches are going to slowly weather over time. The bark is going to slowly weather off, and you're going to be left with these very beautiful sort of whitish, grayish colored deadwood features on the tree. So we want to sort of reenact that, or recreate that rather, in our bonsai. All right, so we're going to take off this here.